Recently, I had a chance to sit down with my old friend, Ann Edminster. I met Ann, probably about 15 years ago when I was first introduced to home performance and green building and really sent me off in a different direction as a builder and remodeling contractor in California. Luckily, at the time, I was in the Bay Area, San Francisco area, up in Marin County, doing work as a contractor, and the movement towards green building and net zero and indoor air quality issues and making sure your home worked better, et cetera, was really starting to take off, especially there in the Bay Area. And Anne was very much an advocate of higher performing buildings. She was she was a one of the founders and one of the founding members in the structure and how it was built, the whole residential program for the LEED system, as well as a lot of other advocacy groups and organizations throughout her career. She's always been a part of the built environment and improving the built environment. And still to this day, Anne is out there hitting the streets, helping organizations and entities improve their training practices, improving their advocacy, pushing for net zero emissions. It used to be back in the day, we were looking for net zero energy to be a target. But now she has corrected us and shared with us we should be focused on the emissions of a building, especially homes, and even in our own environment and on how we live our lives. We can reduce carbon quite substantially just by the choices we make. So enjoy this interview with Anne. I'm sure you'll love it, and you'll have some links below to the organizations that she talks about. Enjoy. So I know you from the camp of high performance builders, et cetera, and I briefly got to know you back in the day. But can you refresh my memory on how you got into what you're doing today versus what you were doing? I know that you were a teacher for a while. Is that correct? Is that what you were doing?
Well,
Oh,
teaching has been part of my, I guess, green building career for, quarter century, but I've
right.
never been a teacher.
I see. So you've always helped others, educating and teaching others. Always
Yeah,
felt like that was your calling.
in the industry. Yeah,
Right,
but
right.
yeah, I come from a family of teachers, so I think it was one of those inescapable things.
Maybe that's what I remember. Those stories of you talking about your parents being teachers,
Yeah, probably
and
so.
just that love of sharing knowledge. And I get it. I love being able to do that whenever I can in any context. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's like I joke too and say, when I was early into the green building work, I did a lot of volunteering. And at some point, I
Hmm.
realized that volunteering is a slippery slope to teaching and that in turn to leadership.
Ah, interesting. It's kind of a half pipe, if you will, kind of slippery, and then it kind of pops up the other side.
Yeah, there's
That's
definitely some corkscrews in there too.
yeah, exactly. A lot of pins and arrows and scars along the way.
A little bit of that, yeah.
Right. So you were you more of the kind of the generalist kind of a consultant, or were you an architect, and did you kind of use that as part of your injection into that?
Yeah, I have both a bachelor's and a master's in architecture with a hefty gap in between where I wasn't sure what I wanted to do when I grew up. Um, so yeah, that's always kind of been the launch pad for this. And in my early stage career um, of design work, I did like 100+ residential remodels in the course of which I learned a lot about houses. So, because, you're dealing with existing houses and how they went together and should have gone together and can be modified. And so you see them in a very different way than if you're just designing new or just walking around inside them, right? So that was a really good foundation for.
Was that your was that during that period, was that kind of your aha moment of kind of the I mean, that's kind of exactly how it hit me. I was a remodeling contractor and I just saw the I'd have clients that would remodel their kitchen every 3 years, and it was just such a waste of materials and labor and everything in between. And it just got and luckily I was in the Bay Area, so I was influenced by very progressive kind of environmentally minded contractors and like, hey, they're doing things a little bit different. So that was kind of my tribe that I was hanging with. What was your influence? How did that kind of break you out of the
Yeah, well,
normal?
it waste was definitely part of it. I mean, I think I came out of the womb abhorring waste. I
Mm.
just like that's just been a part of my makeup forever. And so definitely seeing the waste in the industry was very troubling to me. And I also kind of grew up as an environmentalist. It's like I spent time in wilderness, in the High Sierra as a teenager and a young person. I cleaned up birds on the beaches after the first big Santa Barbara oil spill, and that had a tremendous influence on me. That was a very, very disturbing experience. So those things kind of converged when the sort of precursors to the green building movement started to, make waves, little waves in the late 80s. Started to hear about things like sick building syndrome, and um, that was like a big aha. And somehow or other, I think either the first or the second issue of Environmental Building News found its way to me, which was really great. And so I was a very, very, very early subscriber and devotee to that. And that's what sent me back to graduate school. It's like finally I felt like, oh, right, this is my niche, right? Is this
Ah,
thing that didn't really have a name yet, green building or environmental building.
did they have any of that in in the advanced education that you were attempting to go back into? Did they recognize that?
Well, there were, yeah, certain profs who did. There was definitely no program, but I was lucky enough because you know I had a home, I had a husband, I had a business. I wasn't going to go away to grad school, so it was like, well, go to grad school where I can go to grad school, which is UC Berkeley. And I figured people say, oh, do they have a program in that? I'm like, no, but I'll make it work. So, but I was really lucky that there were profs there who were really into the green side of energy and the green side of materials, and those were my two primary focus areas were energy, materials, and also housing. It's like I've always been interested only pretty much in residential architecture, where people live, how they live. I don't care about big buildings. Well, I care about them, but not like I want to design or have anything to do with them. That's not my interest at all. Yeah. So, yeah, and I was just really lucky that I was able to kind of pull together a program that was very, very interesting to me and gave me a lot of opportunity for growth.
Right. So after that program, you were kind of like the shiny emerald jewel on the block because you were like one of the few, right? I mean, it had that in my mind. I
Uh,
mean, we looked up to you folks and like, wow, those are the experts in the field, and you were kind of that was just a few years before we got into
mhm.
it. So it's this weird. It's still in its infancy, but it's weird how rapidly it accelerated, got high peak on the wave, and then the wave kind of crashed on the beach, and then now it's just we're trying to keep it afloat and still breathing. And I'm like, yeah, I'll never give up. I love being passionate about it, and especially the residential, like you said, it's where we live, it's where we have family and grow up and all of that. So yeah, that is so cool that you got into it in school. So was it hard to attract clients or in that environment? I mean, like you said, the Bay Area, they were kind of already prescribed to having some kind of environmental awareness
Yeah,
of
although
what they were doing, their touch on the planet,
mhm.
et cetera.
Well, it's interesting because when I came out of grad school, my career focus just kind of flipped on a dime. It was kind of serendipitous, I guess you would say. I met a woman named Dana Sharon. Her name at the time was Dana Harmon. I don't know if you ever met Dana, but at the time she was running a project for Rainforest Action Network that was called the Wood Reduction Clearinghouse. And we hit it off immediately, and I started working with Dana on a project around wood reduction in the residential building industry. That's a tough sell, as you can imagine.
Right.
It's like,
Right.
less wood in residential
Yeah.
buildings. But that project eventually moved from from a Rainforest Action Network to Nader's organization in DC. And at that time, NRDC recruited me to join them essentially in the same campaign. And so I worked with NRDC for close to 10 years. The, the project they originally brought me in for was writing a book called, this is the scintillating title of Efficient Wood Use in Residential Construction, a practical guide to saving wood, money, and forests.
Oh my
So,
goodness.
but it was an awesome project. I loved working on that,
Right.
and again, learned a lot, met a lot of great people, and it's funny because that little book, which is NRDC published, it was not commercially published, but it became kind of a cult classic, and so I got a lot of opportunities to kind of share the message that that book had. And then from that, I was recruited to join the U.S. Green Building Council's nascent residential team, still as an
Hmm.
NRDC staffer, but the U.S. Green Building Council, as you probably know, did a lot of the early
Right.
work on LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design program, via volunteer involvement. And so I was recruited as a member of the LEED residential committee, which I ended up chairing after a couple of years. The initial chair had to
Wow.
go off and do other work at a certain point, and then I was tapped as a chair, co-chair for that.
So before they had the residential section, did they were already existing organization and then they decided to go residential, or was it
No, they
reverse?
did. They started with the commercial program for LEED, and that's always been its
Yeah, that's what I thought.
flagship. The residential program has always been kind of the Cinderella within the LEED family, to be blunt about it.
Gotcha.
And so we had our challenges cut out for us, but it was another really, um, I think, worthwhile and productive experience, despite some of the uphill aspects to it.
Right.
So I ended
Right.
up, working, just jumping right into these programs, and pretty much abandoned my design practice. But at the same time, I
Interesting.
ended up also advising design teams. So, but that was more of kind of a sideline. My main gig was really these
Right.
sort of bigger programmatic efforts and the education around them. So that's where, in fact, I remember at some point fairly early in that stage, um, ended up talking to somebody about my family and said, "Yeah, everybody in my family except me teaches." And then I went, "Oh, wait a minute. That used to be true, but it's not true anymore," because I had found myself pretty rapidly getting involved in the teaching side of
Right.
it, particularly after publishing that book with NRDC,
Hmm.
because like that was the next phase.
Right.
It's like, wow, well, now we've done this research. We need to teach people about what we learned through doing that research. So, how you can save
Was
wood.
that the precursor to right? Was that book the precursor to smart or like advanced framing techniques, or was it kind of a
It,
parallel?
it actually,
It just so happened.
there's a chapter in it on advanced framing or optimum value engineering. There was sort of a debate about which term was better at the time. Advanced framing is the one that seems to
Right.
have stuck more, but um, no, in fact, the
Right.
National Association of Home Builders had done the seminal
Oh,
research on
interesting.
that, and we sort of recapped it and updated it, condensed and highlighted and so forth.
I see.
Yes. So,
Gotcha.
but they were. really in the forefront. But the irony is, so that book was published in 1998, and I think the work NAHB had done on it predated that by at least a decade, if not two or three. But it's one of those things that just has not taken hold. Um, in recent years, it's gotten a little bit more traction as materials have gotten heinously expensive, and there are still devotees out there, but it's just so much easier to just keep throwing more sticks at something.
Right,
So,
right. And that's always, I mean, you and I have seen these audiences and had these clients, and some have high expectations, some are just doing it to do it, some are, greenwashing and everything in between. And I currently, where I'm at, I work with a lot of production builders, and they won't spend one penny over what it costs, anything extra, they're going for the programs to some extent. A lot of them are doing the HERS and getting the scores and doing Energy Star, and very few green programs. But even the Energy Star folks, there's a requirement. I forget which basket we're in, but there's a smart framing component. And I keep telling the guys, the instructors are telling the raters, "Hey, here, check for smart framing like this." And I said, "Well, that's just one component of smart framing," and they didn't understand that. They thought that was,
oh
that one
my.
little piece was the smart framing. So it was like, way over their
Uh-huh.
heads. So even the experts don't really know sometimes what it all entails, and every little piece is just part of the
Right.
puzzle, but the puzzle has to be built well, and they don't
Yeah,
they don't
yeah.
get it.
No, very true.
So
Yeah, and you don't really achieve the
so
savings with it, either the material savings or the thermal improvements, unless you go about it in a more methodical and holistic way.
right, right. I remember my old mentor Mark Richmond used to say, "How much does your house weigh?" And he posed this to the builders, and the builders would all look at each other like, "I don't know. Have you ever weighed your house?" Like, but his point was, how much weight, how many sticks are you putting in it that you
Right.
don't really need? Yeah, but it made him pause and think about it for a minute. It's like, oh, that makes sense. But yeah, it's a tough sell, like you said. And I've talked to the architects and the Graham and Terry and everybody, and you know, Graham is a big favorite, fan of modularized walls and prefab construction to. Uh, and I get it from the production standpoint, but can you achieve that modular built wall, but in a smart advanced framing or goal to net zero way, and separate site from production? That's always been the tricky part of getting builders to say it's cheaper, faster, better somehow, but they don't
Yeah,
believe it.
well, in fact, another chapter in that NRDC book was on panelization or modularization. So, and that's another one that's been really, really slow to take hold. I think that is going to shift. I think it is shifting, though. Finally, it just takes decades for some of these things to move, and to have examples from other parts of the world where, in China, that's entirely common, and there are good reasons for that because there are savings to be had through the process, and you can protect the structure by having so much of it done under roof instead of exposed to weather, and you know um, a lot less waste and so forth. So there are very good reasons for that. And certainly a lot of people who have um, been part of the bleeding edge in that arena who can speak to the challenge of trying to shove that boulder up the hill. Um, but I think it'll get there of necessity. But, we're, as Americans, I think, as a culture, we're iconoclasts, and nobody wants their house to be exactly like somebody else's, and we're very, very loath to give up on the single family detached house in a moat of grass model, and understand. I
Yeah.
was talking to one of our city council members the other day, and he said, we have to understand that the future is not single family. I absolutely agree. We don't have the luxury on this planet of thinking that we can
Hmm.
keep building that way. We can't afford to
Reason.
spread
Yeah.
ourselves over the land. that way because the
Right.
land is needed for other things, like all the ecosystem services
Right.
that it provides. And we need to be closer together
Yeah.
so we're not, spending all our time in traffic and spewing emissions and all that stuff.
It's so cool that you got invited into those programs. You had some influence, and you definitely spearheaded the lead for home stuff. I know, and I got in it early just as a raider. Just that's when I first heard about the lead part. I was already doing hers, but I was more interested in saving stuff and validating performance and paying attention to materials and quality and quantity and all that stuff. So the lead stuff was very appealing. You're my expert on net zero, whether it's, and we could talk for hours about what
Right.
definition you want to use. And I'll let you pick one and we can ride with it. I don't, I just think about if I'm going to build a house for somebody and they want to be net zero, they want to produce as much as they use in a year. That seems doable, but are there caveats to that? Are there or side issues to that? Because one complaint I hear all the time is, yeah, you're net zero through the year, but you're still affecting the grid in the middle of
Hmm.
summer like everybody else. You know, you're not really saving energy that day. What have you. But so, how do you combat those kind of complaints or
Well, this does
pushback?
go to sort of definitions. And I think that, initially that the concept is very appealing that if I produce as much energy as I use on an annual basis, that feels somehow equitable, like I've done my share. And that principle, I think, is still a very sound principle. But as the state policy has been developing, and initially the state sort of set its sights on that very goal. But as the state was moving in that direction and laying the track in front of the train, in effect, towards that destination, the realization came about that, oh, right, but just because something balances out over the course of a year doesn't mean you've actually addressed all the issues with energy use along the way. And specifically, that there we have emissions associated with operating the power plants that provide the energy we're using, say, when the sun isn't shining or when the wind turbines aren't cranking, right? And so when that light bulb went off for the state, finally, belatedly, they started to, redirect the Queen Mary and say, all along, we've been using energy as a proxy for emissions, right? And that worked to a point. And then it became clear that it wasn't enough, that we actually had to address emissions head on. So that was the necessary shift, I think, for all of us to make. And so,
So from
yeah,
energy to carbon, that
exactly. And
click.
so,
Gotcha.
that's where I am right now. It's like, great, that's where we should have been all along. I'm so happy that, again, policy direction is focused that way now, as I am. So, but I still do like the goal of it's a both and, right? Like, so we should be attempting to use no more energy than can be provided sort of by us, near us, on our own structure. And we should also be striving to have zero emissions. And so what that means is we've got to eliminate fossil fuels. And to me, that's the big zero that we should be striving for right now. Because while the larger forces of our state and our society are gradually, again, making that shift in our electrical grid to make it cleaner and cleaner, we still have to clean it up at the individual site level. So, and the way we do that with new construction is to say, we're just not going to build with fossil fuel infrastructure in our buildings anymore. I mean, there are a few notable exceptions of just certain types of, say, industrial uses that don't have a viable electric alternative right now. But for residential construction, where you and I both operate, it's absolutely feasible and, in fact, highly desirable to go all electric. So solving it with new construction, at least in as a matter of principle, is easy peasy. On the other hand, we have millions of existing structures that are using fossil fuels that need to get transitioned off of those fossil fuels. That is the big nut to crack. And ideally, at the same time we're doing that, we'll be reducing the demand of those structures overall and providing them with clean energy, all that at the same time. So that's what, I wave my magic
Right,
wand,
right.
that's what it's going to look like. But that's got to be one ass kicking
Yeah.
magic wand.
Yeah, it is. At least California is like leading the charge. I mean, I'm glad I grew up there because I'm proud of my home state. But the other states I've been in, they're like, stay away. We're using our coal. We're using our gas. Even the local officials are like, it ain't going to change anytime soon, son. Get out of, whatever. Is like, wow. It's like this. I guess it's where you grew up or what affected your life growing. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out because you meet some guys from some states and they're all for it, and other ones are like old school. It's like, no, we got entrenchment here. We can't affect the livelihood of XYZ. It's like, how do you argue against that? It's difficult.
I think it's there's a kind of amusing parallel to the natural gas items in our homes. We can think of them as not only being run by fossil fuels, but in a sense on their own way to being fossils, right? And I think that some of those who embody the old way of thinking are also arguably fossilized.
Yeah, it's kind of the running theme of the whole.
Right, exactly. I know. It's like I remember I did one presentation one time where I had a picture of a dinosaur. It's like, you don't want to be one of these. So I love the,
Right. Yeah, you don't want to hang out in that tar pit. They thought it was a pool and they jumped into the tar pit.
yeah, so
Yeah.
there's a bunch of entertaining parallels there. But I really do think, quite realistically, that the old ideas have to die off. And, Kevin, you and I are very
Right.
youthful, but there are
Yeah.
those who are less youthful who just won't be around influencing things that much
Right.
longer.
I agree. I mean, definitely appreciate and admire the youth that's coming up and making their voices heard, and we'll keep shouting. And you have to keep correcting me because if it's zero carbon is the goal, and I definitely push for all electric anyway. But I would hate to build someone a all electric mansion and they were filled with 5 Teslas, and it's like they've kind of defeated my personal philosophy, but it could be theirs. But I guess but it sounds like carbon is the way we got to do it, though. It's the only way to kind of combat future issues and problems.
If we don't solve the climate change problem, we won't have time to solve the other problems. So, yeah, I mean, but the consumption is a huge issue, so the too much of everything is part of the challenge as well. And there are too many people with, multiple residences that aren't being occupied. Meanwhile, we have people on the streets. It's like, there's something wrong with this equation here. And as you say, the mega homes, the McMansions, and that. On the other hand, I've had some incredible clients who are extremely fortunate and are able to build really exemplary projects which serve as inspirations for others. So that serves a purpose
Right.
in our grand picture as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad you painted it that way because some people would say, "Oh, they just threw a bunch of money at it to make it do this or that." And it's like, well, sometimes you got to make the point that it's
Absolutely.
accomplishable. It's doable. Maybe you can figure out a way to do it cheaper, better, faster. that's your mission, but we just wanted to get it out there and show that it could be done, because I've seen people spend a ton of money on whatever insulation or windows or high tech, water heating system, whatever, and it's just like, wow, you spent 100 grand more than you probably needed to, but I'm glad you're cool with your reward at the end of the tunnel. But they they serve as
They
educational
do.
signposts for
They
sure,
do.
right? I
And,
mean,
you
yeah.
know, we're kind of a celebrity mad culture, and we look up to those who are wealthy and prominent. And so we need the examples in those quarters as well. And so people who create things that are functional and beautiful and high performance and all electric, great. Those are
Yeah.
yeah,
Check
exactly.
all those boxes.
We won't all be able to afford
Right. Yeah.
the crazy high end of things, but if we take away the message that something can be high performance and beautiful and it's the right thing to do, and that's what, the people we look up to are doing, that is an excellent message for our society.
Yeah, I remember going to the, what were they called? The solar decathlons, where the kids would all from different schools would, little mini, and they were so cool to just watch and look at the creativity. And sure, the cost, it would be enormous or whatever, but just to think of it that way outside of the box, we're so used to our rigorous, how we were taught or whatever, and so refreshing to see new vision. I see that you're still doing work with counties and cities and different programs. What do you like to do these days? Is that your kind of your flavor
Well,
of what you are, you like to kind of spread it around, or what? What keeps you busy? What keeps you
yeah,
interested these days?
it is more and more on the education side of things. So, as we've already talked about,
Mm.
I've done a fair amount myself of being involved in educating others in the industry around better building practices. And now I'm also helping other organizations figure out how to improve their educational offerings. So, not necessarily teaching myself, sometimes I'm still doing some of that, but also just thinking about what are we teaching? Who are we teaching it to? How do we reach a wider audience? How do we create the educational programs in such a way that they are accessible and appealing to a wider audience? Because one of our biggest challenges, I think, in the several decades you and I have been involved in this game, is that our audience has not expanded enough. We really haven't reached as many people as we should have reached in the years that we've been doing this. And it's because the institutions haven't been asking those questions of, like, how do we get to more people? They've been saying, well, we have this bucket of money and we can spend it on education. Okay, we'll do that. Instead of, how do we leverage that and get it diffused as far as possible? That's the real question.
So you think that was the missing component of why the movement kind of not stagnated, but kind of froze for a while. It seemed to me as like it
Hmm.
didn't move along. We had our tribe, but
Yeah.
like you said, it didn't grow. So you're tying it back to the
Yeah, I think
educational
there's
system, or
never been enough time, money, effort, or credibility invested in the importance of education. I think you can still get a degree in engineering and architecture without any knowledge of the principles of resource efficient building, right? I mean, that's lamentable. And so there have been these little pots of money created through, going back to California and our Title 24 and the creation of a pot of money, public goods funds that were dedicated to education, which is great, but it's a drop in the bucket. Again, it should be happening much earlier. It should be happening in grade school, middle school, high school, every university program, and yet it isn't. And so this is the question. I remember, oh, yeah, probably around 2010, one of the utilities that I did some work with established a a zero net energy advisory council or something. And I remember at the first meeting, they said, well, we have X, million dollars to spend to advance this idea of zero net energy. And, so much money is going into technical assistance and so much money into, whatever competition and demonstration programs. And this tiny sliver was dedicated to education. And I was like, it should all go into education. It was like, yeah, whatever, you know. But yeah, well, to be fair, in a sense, demonstration projects and things are a form of education or lead. They have educational co-benefits, but yeah, we have to be doing a better job.
Has their taste changed, or is there a way to
Hmm.
to spark that interest in them today? Then it might have been different for us. We were, I mean, I'm my parents
Hmm.
weren't hippie, but they were from that generation of just coming out of it and just a little. So I don't know. I ask myself the same question: how do we spark interest in this movement? And is it the chicken and the egg syndrome? Does the education need to be there for them to be attracted to it, or does the attraction need to spur the educational institution
Well, it's
to create
probably
the
a both
program?
and, but I mean, I think I do have, I have a 22-year-old who lives under my roof, and so I have that contact with younger people, and also work with some younger folks directly. My sense is that young people, unless they are completely oblivious, are very concerned about what the planet they're living on is going to be like for them in the future. So I think that anxiety is making them very interested in solutions. It's a bittersweet thing, but it's a both and. I mean, it's always a both and. Like it's incumbent on our generations to be resources to the younger generations. Help figure out how we can create a better future for them and support them in their efforts because they're doing a great job of, in many cases, educating their elders and calling us on the carpet for what we haven't accomplished. So, but I'm very hopeful.
Yeah, I am too, and I have a he's 35, 36, an older son, but he's definitely same issue, same anxiety. So he's definitely clued in more than we were. I remember as a young teenager seeing the green ecology whatever symbol was on my sister's backpack, and didn't understand what the whole and until later, but that was my first impact. And now it's like this burden that they're carrying, and I feel sad about that. But I too want to be there for them and help them in any way I can. Um, so I'm glad we're both still kicking it and just kicking that can down the road and just kind of keep plugging that message because it's the reality of our future. And if we, the quicker we absorb it, the better we can get there and take care of business. And I was just gonna, yeah, I was just gonna say too. I wish more of the youth would demand energy efficient homes when they're out there purchasing, because right now they're just getting whatever the lowest price is, or whatever. And I think you can accomplish, zero carbon emissions even in every community if they wanted to. They're just not hearing that demand, and they very much are tuned into that demand of their buyer. So I encourage those that are in that market to make that voice heard.
Yes and no. I mean, I think the challenge is that when by the time you go shopping for a house, all the decisions about the houses that are available to you were made many years prior. So there's a big disconnect between the demand and the supply sides of the equation. And so the supply side tends to be very driven by inertia, the inertia of the industry of like, well, this is what we've been doing, so this is what we keep doing because this is what's easiest to keep doing. This is what we know how to do, and change is difficult, right? So And then the other piece of it, again, the educational piece, is you don't know to ask for something that you don't know exists. If you've never seen an example of something like this, you don't even know it has a name, and you don't know how to ask for it. And of course, what people care most about in a home is where it is, right? Location, location, location. So it's it's really incumbent upon us who are in the industry and our institutions to force that change. And I think there's some very good work that's being done on demand. Right now, there's a campaign called The Switch Is On that was developed by the Building Decarbonization Coalition. That's a public facing campaign to get people to ask for electric homes and to ask to get their existing homes electrified. So, this is a step in the right direction. But consumer oriented messaging is a very expensive undertaking. That's why Madison Avenue exists and why there's a huge amount of money that goes into those types of campaigns. We're not Pepsi, we're not Monsanto, we're not, Johnson and Johnson, Procter and Gamble, and so forth. And so that is the challenge. But my belief is that our what's incumbent upon each of us as individuals is not only to act within what's our control occupationally, but as members of the civic body. This is where it matters. We've got to be advocating for action from local government. Local government policy is making a big change here in California now, and as well as in other parts of the country. Both the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest are also seeing lots of changes with local policies that are having major impacts. And with our state and federal governments, we need to make our voices heard in, at every possible opportunity, because we need mandates, not just voluntary programs, not just consumer demand.
Right. Talking points, right? Totally agree. Well said. What's your stance on nuclear energy?
I do not claim to be hugely well educated on the issue, but I am absolutely gut opposed to it. And this is, just based on concerns about management of the waste and the process associated with it. I mean, I understand that there's a big difference between fission and fusion, but I can't really venture too far down that road.
Right. I too am, and I can't either. I was just curious because I live in a part of the country now that is luckily they've shied away from coal and all that, and gas is, to some extent being.
Mhm.
It just depends on what part of the state you're standing in, but their main source right now is nuclear. And it's like, well, it kind of fits both criteria. It's a scary thing, but it's low emitting, and it's like this is weird. But I agree. I'm on a personal level. I'm not a fan,
Yeah.
but I was just curious what
Okay.
your take on it was. So thank you for that. So, and just as a wrap up, I just want to where you you sent the message, and I totally get it. We got to be advocates for all of this smart thinking, smart planning, smart educating of our community, as of our society. What, on a personal note, if I just walked in your office and said, what are some things I can do to reduce my carbon footprint, and maybe you can share some of those quick. What are those few things that, as a homeowner?
Well, I'd say take a look at all your natural gas appliances, figure out how old they are, when they are likely to age out, and preemptively replace those that are, well along in their lifespan. Because having them fail on you, first of all, is a very unpleasant experience. And secondly, to replace them with electric appliances right now, um, when you're in crisis mode, can be pretty challenging because there are supply issues. Of course, there's supply issues with all kinds of things in the world today, right? So especially now, of all times. And there are also challenges in some cases. Let's say you're replacing a gas furnace with an electric heat pump. There may be also challenges having the right skilled labor available to make that replacement for you. Conceivably, if you say, well, I'm looking ahead and I actually want to replace all of my natural gas uses with electric downstream, that might entail an electric panel upgrade. So it's really important to kind of lay out the pathway for yourself and figure out what's the logical sequence to tackle these things in.
I'm glad you brought that up because it's not as simple as
Right.
changing a pair of shoes. It's like there's the cost of the other pair of shoes plus all these other shoelaces you have to buy to make those other pair
Right.
of shoes fit better, right? I mean, we got to put in wiring and panels and
Exactly.
reroute
And
stuff,
you might need to
and
have
yeah.
your
So
orthotics refitted.
okay, okay, great. There you go.
Yeah, exactly.
Ouch. Right. Okay, so gas using appliances, evaluate those for longevity and the costs involved of that swap out. Okay, what else?
Right. Exactly. And just, get your ducks in a row. Figure out, who's going to do the work for you, what it's going to cost, you know, what equipment you want or that they recommend, and what sequence it makes sense to do things in. And of course, the other one is same principle applies on the transportation side of our lifestyles, right? Like, let's try and get out of our gas-fueled vehicles. I'm personally kind of gearing up to face that issue myself. Fortunately, I haven't had to drive very much the last couple of years. So yeah, yeah, been kind of stalling that decision. But that's the other big one, depending on where you live and what your lifestyle is and what you're driving, um, your house or your transportation may represent, the biggest part of your emissions footprint.
Right. And I guess that kind of maybe is step one is evaluating your footprint. How far do I have to drive to work? How bad is my house? How far do I have to drive this kids to school? And there's all this weighing of if I'm truly looking at my footprint. It's not just housing, it's all these other things.
Right, exactly. And just, get your ducks in a row. Figure out, who's going to do the work for you, what it's going to cost, you know, what equipment you want or that they recommend, and what sequence it makes sense to do things in. And of course, the other one is same principle applies on the transportation side of our lifestyles, right? Like, let's try and get out of our gas-fueled vehicles. I'm personally kind of gearing up to face that issue myself. Fortunately, I haven't had to drive very much the last couple of years. So yeah, yeah, been kind of stalling that decision. But that's the other big one, depending on where you live and what your lifestyle is and what you're driving, um, your house or your transportation may represent, the biggest part of your emissions footprint.
Right. Right. And I guess that kind of maybe is step one is evaluating your footprint. How far do I have to drive to work? How bad is my house? How
Right.
far do I have to drive this kids to school? And there's all this weighing of
Right.
if
Yeah.
I'm
Can
truly
I can
looking at
I
my footprint.
yeah, can I
It's
group
not
my
just housing,
trips?
it's all these
So
other
instead of
things, right?
making all separate trips, I can, do 5 errands in one loop and use half as much fuel to do it.
Okay, so there's housing, there's the appliances of the house, there's how we drive and how we get around. What else can we do as individuals?
Well, there's a lot, but those two together for most people are probably going to represent a good solid, 80, even 90% of their everyday impact.
Right.
Travel, vacations,
Right.
leisure is probably another big bucket. And of course,
Yeah.
it overlaps,
Right.
the other two to some extent. But that's another one to look at, flying.
The positive side of COVID might be all the millions of miles not spent. And I know that's a bad thing to say, but um, I agree with you. Travel. I mean, do you think? I mean, it might be futuristic, but do you think we'll be able to travel just virtually and not have to go anywhere and just put on the goggles? Yeah, the Hawaii goggles on and be good to go.
But I do think, there are larger forces afoot that, there's one of the listservs I participate on, occasionally the subject of air travel comes up, and there are people who say, well, I've forsworn air travel. I'm only going to go if I have to go to a funeral, or I'll take the train cross country. And there are others who say that's admirable, but these are problems that have to be solved at a cultural scale. And there are, I do actually see articles now and then about electric aviation, which I find really exciting. And so there's hope for that stuff too. But meanwhile, again, these are choices. And I think that the pandemic has given us a taste of what it means to reduce our impacts in certain ways and to find out, okay, sure, it's in some ways it's hard, but on the other hand, I think about like what my lifestyle has been like as opposed to say what my parents was, which was much more modest, and their parents. We have been ridiculously privileged as a generation, certainly not uniformly. Obviously, there's a lot of inequity in the distribution of wealth and opportunity. But our generation that grew up in the era of post World War II prosperity, the with the erroneous belief that things will always keep getting better. Yeah, meaning we will have more and more goodies and more privilege and more opportunity. That was a fool's, delusion, right? So when I look at that and think, oh, poor me, I haven't, gotten to go anywhere exotic for 2 years. Wah, 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 get out my little violin, right? Yeah, it's
Yeah,
just
boo-hoo, right?
like,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I hear you. I definitely I couldn't agree with you more. It's like there's a little slap on the back of the head saying, "Hey,
yeah,
stop that." Which is a reality check. So, and you're right. It's kind of proven to ourselves that it's survivable. We
yeah,
don't need to have these extraneous things. We can survive and still. I mean, I miss hanging out with people at
right.
work and
And
societal
that's, I think,
events and all that stuff.
that's the key takeaway for me. It's like, what do I miss the most? It's being around people, the people that I'm fond of. And so, and of course, some of that is related to travel, who I get to see by virtue of where I get to go. But even locally, I think just realizing that it's the enrichment of being around people that is the most important piece. And I think this is where, when we look to a future lifestyle that is at an impact level that's consistent with a livable planet, we need to focus on how do we make our lives very rich in our local places with the people around us.
Well, I'm glad you're around me because you've definitely been an influence and awe-inspiring for me. And I want to thank you for all that you do. And thank you so much for your time, Ann. I really appreciate it. And keep up the good work.
Thank you, Kevin. That's really sweet, and right back at you.